A high school classroom, a sleeping student, and a 911 call that spirals into a national scandal. What happens when a teacher's prejudice meets a student's hidden reality? When Mrs. Albright saw Imani, a black girl, asleep in her AP physics class, she assumed the worst. She saw defiance, disrespect, and a reason to call the police. But she missed one crucial detail. A detail the principal would reveal moments after the handcuffs came out. A detail that would not only exonerate Imani, but unleash a firestorm of consequences that would bring a powerful institution to its knees. This isn't just a story about a nap. The fluorescent lights of room 314 at Northwood High School hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune, a sound that had become the soundtrack to Mrs. Karen Albright's 47th year of life and her 23rd year of teaching. From her perch behind a large oak desk, cluttered with towers of ungraded papers and a collection of world's best teacher mugs that felt more like relics from a bygone era, she surveyed her kingdom of bored teenagers. It was a Monday fourth period AP Physics, the graveyard shift of the academic day. The students, a mix of ambitious future engineers and those simply fulfilling a graduation requirement, stared back at her with the glassy-eyed apathy she'd come to expect. Her gaze, however, always lingered a little longer, a little sharper on Imani Washington. Imani was new, not just to Northwood, but to the entire state. She'd arrived 2 months into the semester, a mid-year transfer from somewhere down south, a detail Karen couldn't be bothered to remember precisely. What she did remember, what she couldn't ignore, was that Imani was black. In a predominantly white, affluent school like Northwood, Imani's presence was to Karen an anomaly. She wasn't like the other few black students who had passed through these halls, the athletes with their easy smiles and scholarships, or the children of established, well-to-do families who lived in the same gated communities as the other parents on the PTA. Imani was different. She was quiet, almost unnervingly so. She sat in the back, never raised her hand, and offered one-word answers when called upon. Her clothes weren't designer labels. Her backpack was a simple worn canvas, and she carried an air of exhaustion that Karen found deeply irritating. It was the exhaustion Karen had decided of someone who didn't belong, someone who was in over their head, and simply didn't care. Today, that irritation was curdling into outright anger. While Karen was attempting to explain the complex beauty of Maxwell's equations, a topic she still found thrilling, she saw it. Imani's head, covered in a cascade of intricate braids that Karen found distracting, was dipping. Her chin touched her chest, then snapped back up. A classic sign. The prelude to the ultimate act of disrespect. Miss Washington. Karen's voice was sharp, cutting through the hum of the lights. Is there something more interesting happening inside your eyelids than the fundamental laws of electromagnetism? A few students snickered. Imani's head shot up. Her dark eyes wide and momentarily unfocused. They were beautiful eyes, large and almond-shaped, but right now they were clouded with a sleep-drunk haze. "No, Mrs. Albright," she mumbled, her voice thick. "I'm sorry." Sorry doesn't grasp the concept of talk, does it? Karen retorted, turning back to the whiteboard. She felt a small, bitter satisfaction at the ripple of laughter from the class. She was still in control. She could still command a room. But 10 minutes later, as she was drawing a diagram of an electromagnetic field, she saw it again. This time, Imani didn't jerk back up. Her head had tilted to the side, her cheek resting against the cool, smooth surface of her desk. Her breathing was deep and even. She was asleep. Fast asleep. A hot, furious blush crept up Karen's neck. The audacity in her class, her AP Physics class, the jewel in Northwood High's academic crown. This wasn't just laziness. It was a deliberate act of defiance. It was a statement that everything Karen stood for, rigor, discipline, the pursuit of knowledge, was a joke. She saw the other students noticing. Whispers broke out like tiny fires in the corners of the room. A boy named Kyle, a notorious class clown, pretended to snore loudly before being shushed by his friends. The disruption was escalating. Her authority was eroding with every peaceful breath Imani took. Karen's mind raced. What were the protocols? Wake the student, send them to the officer detention slip. That was the standard procedure. But this felt different. This felt personal. This was a challenge. And Karen Albright never backed down from a challenge. She thought about the articles she'd read on her Neighborhood Watch Facebook group, the hushed conversations at the local country club. Stories about rising crime, about a changing demographic, about the need to be vigilant, about those people who brought their problems with them. Imani, in her exhausted, silent defiance, became the embodiment of those fears. In Karen's mind, her sleeping form transformed from a tired teenager into a symbol of a threat to the order she held so dear. She walked slowly, deliberately down the aisle, her sensible heels clicking ominously on the linoleum floor. The students fell silent, their eyes tracking her movement. They could sense a shift in the atmosphere, the professional detachment of a teacher replaced by something harder, colder. She stood over Imani's desk, looking down at her. In sleep, the girl looked younger, more vulnerable. Her long lashes rested on her dark skin. Her lips were slightly parted. For a fleeting moment, a sliver of doubt pierced Karen's anger. Was she just a tired kid? Then she saw Imani's phone, an older model screen, cracked, lying face down on the desk. And that was it. The final piece of evidence in the case she was building in her head. She was probably up all night on that thing, Karen thought with a sneer of confirmation. TikTok, Instagram. Whatever it was, they were all addicted to. This wasn't exhaustion from hard work. It was the lethargy of a misspent youth. That's it, she muttered under her breath. Standard procedure wasn't going to cut it. A message needed to be sent. A hard line needed to be drawn. She returned to her desk, her movements stiff with a sense of righteous purpose. The students watched bewildered as she picked up her own phone. She ignored their curious stares, the palpable tension in the room. Her fingers trembling slightly with adrenaline, dialed the 3 numbers that would escalate this classroom incident into a life-altering event. The school resource officer, a doughy, perpetually bored man named Officer Miller, was the standard first call. But Karen dialed 911. She wanted a real response. She wanted sirens. She wanted to show that there were consequences for this level of disrespect. 911, what's your emergency? The calm voice of the dispatcher asked. Karen lowered her voice, infusing it with a sense of urgent peril. Yes, this is Karen Albright, a teacher at Northwood High School. I have a student in my classroom who is unresponsive. I can't wake her. She's become disruptive and I'm concerned for the safety of my other students. It was a lie, a gross exaggeration. Imani wasn't unresponsive, she was asleep. She wasn't disruptive, the disruption was the class's reaction to her sleeping. And a sleeping teenage girl was a threat to no one. But in Karen's mind, the lie was justified. It was a tool to get the response she wanted. The dispatcher's voice became more alert. Okay, ma'am. We're dispatching officers to your location. Are you in a safe place? Yes, Karen said, her heart pounding. I'm at my desk. Please hurry." She hung up the phone and looked up at her class. Their faces were a mixture of shock, confusion, and for a few, a dawning horror. They had all heard her. They all knew Imani was just sleeping. "Mrs. Albright," a girl in the front row. Sarah, a straight-A student, asked tentatively, "You called the police on Imani?" "She's just sleeping." Karen fixed Sarah with an icy glare. "I am handling the situation, Sarah. Your job is to focus on your work." She turned to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and pretended to continue the lesson. Her hand shaking so much she could barely write. The hum of the fluorescent lights was no longer monotonous. It was now a frantic, buzzing prelude to the chaos she had just unleashed. Outside in the distance, a siren began to wail. A sound that was growing closer and closer, coming to answer a call about a danger that existed only in the narrow, frightened confines of a teacher's mind. And in the back of the room, Imani Washington slept on, oblivious to the storm that was about to break over her head. The siren, a distant wail at first, grew into a piercing scream that tore through the sterile quiet of Northwood High. It was a sound usually associated with car accidents on the main road or on rare occasions a fire drill gone wrong. It was not a sound that belonged in the middle of fourth period AP physics. The students' feigned interest in Maxwell's equations evaporated completely. Every head turned towards the windows, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a morbid teenage curiosity. Karen Albright, however, felt a surge of vindication. It was working. The cavalry was coming. She was taking control. She placed her marker down with a decisive click and walked back towards Imani's desk. Her posture ramrod straight. The siren was her validation, the soundtrack to her righteous stand against the creeping decay of discipline and respect. As she approached the sleeping girl, the classroom door burst open. Two police officers, not the familiar paunchy Officer Miller, but two younger, more imposing figures in crisp, dark blue uniforms filled the doorway. Their hands rested instinctively on their hips near their service weapons. Their eyes, trained to assess threats, swept the room. "We got a call about an unresponsive individual, possibly hostile," the taller officer, whose name tag read Donovan, said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded immediate attention. The students shrank back in their seats. This was real. This was not a drill. Karen pointed a trembling finger at Imani. "Her," she said, her voice laced with the gravity she felt the situation deserved. "This student." She wouldn't wake up. She was causing a major disturbance. Officer Donovan and his partner, Officer Riggs, exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance. They saw a room full of scared kids and one girl asleep at her desk. It wasn't exactly the high-stakes situation the dispatcher's report had suggested. Donovan approached Imani's desk cautiously, while Riggs stood by the door. His presence a silent, intimidating barrier. "Ma'am," Donovan said, his voice softer now as he addressed the sleeping girl. "Ma'am, you need to wake up." He reached out and gently shook her shoulder. Imani stirred, a soft groan escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, bleary and confused. The first thing she saw was not the familiar face of a classmate or her teacher, but the uniform, the badge, and the stern, unfamiliar face of a police officer looming over her. Her confusion instantly morphed into panic. Her body tensed, her heart slamming against her ribs. What's happening?" she stammered, pushing her chair back. Her eyes darting around the room, from the two officers to Mrs. Albright's triumphant face, to the shocked and frightened faces of her classmates. "You were sleeping in class," young lady Karen said, crossing her arms. "That is not acceptable at Northwood High." Sleeping Imani's voice was a whisper of disbelief. I was just tired. We got a call that you were unresponsive and being disruptive." Officer Donovan said, his tone professional but firm. He was starting to piece together the gross exaggeration that had brought them here. "Your teacher was concerned for your safety and the safety of others." Imani looked at Mrs. Albright, a dawning, sickening understanding in her eyes. It was a look of betrayal. I was sleeping," she repeated, her voice trembling now. "I didn't do anything wrong." "That's not for you to decide," Karen snapped. "In my classroom, I decide what's wrong." The situation was escalating in a way Officer Donovan hadn't anticipated. He'd expected a simple case of a student needing a nudge, maybe a walk to the nurse's office. But the teacher's animosity was palpable, and the student was becoming increasingly distressed. "Okay, let's all just calm down," Donovan said, holding up a hand. He turned to Imani. "Can I see some ID, ma'am?" "A student ID." Imani fumbled in her backpack, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grasp the zipper. The act of having to prove her identity to a police officer in her own classroom was a profound humiliation. She handed him her student ID. Donovan looked at the card. Imani Washington. Grade 12. He looked back at her. "Okay, Imani. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to step out into the hallway and have a conversation." Am I being arrested?" Imani asked, her voice cracking. Before Donovan could answer, Karen interjected. "She needs to be removed from my classroom. Immediately. I don't feel safe with her here. I want to press charges. For disrupting a school activity." The absurdity of the statement hung in the air, pressing charges for falling asleep. Even Officer Riggs, who had remained silent by the door, raised an eyebrow. The students were now whispering openly, their sympathies clearly shifting to the terrified girl by the second. Mrs. Albright, a voice cut through the tension. Every head turned to the doorway. Standing there was Principal Thompson, a tall, imposing man with graying temples and a reputation for being firm but fair. His presence instantly changed the dynamics of the room. He was flanked by Officer Miller, the school resource officer, who looked flustered and annoyed at being circumvented. "Mr. Thompson," Karen said, surprised. "I was handling it. The situation is under control." Principal Thompson's eyes, however, were not on Karen. They were on Imani, and the look on his face was not one of anger or disappointment. It was a look of profound concern and recognition. He walked past the officers and knelt beside Imani's desk, his voice a low, calming rumble. "Imani, are you all right?" I heard the call on the radio. "What happened?" Imani looked up at him, tears welling in her large, dark eyes. I fell asleep, sir. I'm so sorry. I've just been so tired." And she called them. She gestured towards Mrs. Albright and the officers. Principal Thompson's jaw tightened. He stood up and faced Karen. His expression now unreadable, a mask of professional composure that barely concealed a simmering anger. "Karen, what in God's name is going on here?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "You called 911 on a student for falling asleep in your class." Karen felt a flicker of uncertainty, but she doubled down, her voice shrill. She was being insubordinate. Mark. She was unresponsive. It's a clear violation of the code of conduct. I felt threatened. Principal Thompson stared at her for a long, silent moment. The entire room held its breath. The hum of the lights seemed to have stopped. The world seemed to have stopped. He finally broke the silence, his voice clear and resonant, each word landing like a hammer blow. Threatened? You felt threatened by Imani Washington. He let out a short, incredulous laugh that had no humor in it. He turned to Officer Donovan. Officer, do you know who this young lady is? Donovan, looking confused, glanced at the ID still in his hand. Imani Washington, sir. A senior. That's her name. Principal Thompson said, nodding. But that's not who she is. He paused, letting the dramatic weight of his words settle over the room. He looked at Karen, at the officers, at the rapt faces of the students. Mrs. Albright, you have just called the police and attempted to press charges against one of the most remarkable students to ever walk the halls of this school. This young lady who you see as a threat, as a delinquent, is a guest here. She's a visiting scholar. He let that sink in before delivering the final devastating blow. She's here from Johns Hopkins. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of stunned disbelief. The name a titan in the world of medicine and research echoed in the room. Johns Hopkins. It was a name associated with genius, with prestige, with a level of academic achievement that was almost mythical to the students of Northwood High. Karen Albright's face went slack, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Her carefully constructed narrative, her justification for her extreme actions, had just been obliterated by two words: Johns Hopkins. The students began to murmur their whispers now, a tidal wave of shock and dawning comprehension. The quiet new girl, the one everyone ignored, the one their teacher had just tried to have arrested, was some kind of prodigy. Officer Donovan slowly lowered the ID, looking at Imani with a new, profound respect. The girl he had been treating as a potential juvenile delinquent was in fact operating on a level he couldn't even comprehend. But it was Karen who felt the full force of the revelation. The ground had crumbled beneath her feet. The righteous indignation, the fear, the prejudice, it all collapsed, inward, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had committed an act of spectacular public and career-ending stupidity. And in the center of the storm, she had created Imani Washington, finally let the tears fall. Not of fear anymore, but of a deep, bone-weary sadness. She was just a girl trying to balance a world of impossible expectations, and all this teacher had seen, all she had chosen to see, was the color of her skin, and a reason to be afraid. The principal's words had saved her, but the wound of the accusation, the humiliation of the siren, was a scar that wouldn't easily fade. The two words, Johns Hopkins, hung in the air of room 314, altering the very molecular structure of the atmosphere. They were a bomb, and the fallout was just beginning to settle, coating everything in a fine dust of astonishment and shame. Principal Mark Thompson's gaze remained fixed on Karen Albright. He saw the shock on her face, the dawning horror, but he felt no pity. He had known Karen for 15 years. He knew her reputation for being an old school, a term often used as a euphemism for rigid and intolerant. He'd heard the grumblings from students and parents about her biases, her microaggressions, the way she seemed to favor the wealthy white students while barely tolerating the others. He had addressed it subtly in staff meetings about inclusivity and diversity, but he had never had concrete proof, never a smoking gun. Until now. Karen hadn't just provided a smoking gun. She had fired a cannon in the middle of her own classroom. She's... What? Karen finally managed to choke out the words, thin and reedy. A visiting scholar. Principal Thompson repeated his voice, cold and precise. From the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Specifically, she's part of their Summer STEM Institute for Gifted High Schoolers. A program, I might add, that is harder to get into than Harvard. She is here at Northwood as a special request from her program director, Dr. Aris Thorne, a personal friend of mine, to observe different teaching styles in advanced science courses. He let the details wash over the stunned audience. The looks on the students' faces were a spectacle. The boy Kyle, who had mock-snored earlier, was now staring at Imani with a look of slack-jawed awe. Sarah, the girl in the front row, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes shining with what looked like second-hand pride. They weren't just witnessing a classmate being vindicated. They were realizing they had been sitting next to a certified genius, and none of them had had a clue. Principal Thompson turned to the two police officers, who were now looking deeply uncomfortable. Officers, thank you for your prompt response, but as you can see, there is no threat here. There is no crime. There is only a profound and deeply regrettable misunderstanding on the part of my staff member. Officer Donovan nodded quickly, eager to extricate himself from the burgeoning administrative nightmare. Understood, Principal Thompson. We'll be on our way. He handed Imani's ID back to her, his gesture now imbued with a deference that was almost comical in its sudden shift. Sorry for the disturbance, Miss Washington. It's okay, Imani whispered, though it clearly wasn't. As the officers turned to leave, a new voice, sharp and authoritative, sliced through the room. Not so fast. All eyes swiveled to the doorway. A woman stood there, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blue suit. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, behind a pair of stylish glasses and an air of coiled energy that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. Principal Thompson's face broke into a relieved, if strained, smile. Dr. Thorne, I was just about to call you. Dr. Aris Thorne, the program director from Johns Hopkins, strode into the room. She had been on her way to Northwood for a pre-scheduled check-in with Imani, and had arrived to the chaotic scene of a police car parked haphazardly out front, and a palpable sense of crisis in the air. She had followed the commotion to room 314, her expression hardening with every step. She completely ignored Karen Albright, her focus solely on the two departing police officers. Officers, she said, her voice calm, but with an underlying edge of steel. I'm Dr. Aris Thorne. I'm Imani Washington's guardian and academic supervisor while she is in this state. I'd like your names and badge numbers, please. Officers Donovan and Riggs froze, exchanging another uneasy look. This was escalating beyond a simple, sorry for the disturbance. Ma'am, we were just responding to a call, Donovan began, trying to de-escalate. A call which you now know was based on a false report, Dr. Thorne countered smoothly. A report which led to my student, a minor, being interrogated by armed officers in her classroom. I will be filing a formal complaint with your precinct regarding the lack of proper threat assessment and the potential for psychological trauma inflicted on a child. Your names, please. Defeated, the two officers recited their names and badge numbers, which Dr. Thorne recorded meticulously in a small leather-bound notebook she produced from her blazer. She then turned her attention to Principal Thompson. Mark, she said, her tone softening slightly but still carrying a clear current of displeasure. "We need to talk, now, and Imani will be coming with me." She walked over to Imani and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Come on, sweetie, let's get you out of here." She helped the still-shaken girl gather her things, her movements efficient and protective. As she guided Imani towards the door, she finally, for the first time, acknowledged the existence of Karen Albright. She stopped and turned her eyes magnified by her glasses locking onto the teacher. They were not angry eyes. They were something far worse. They were cold, analytical, and utterly dismissive, as if she were examining a particularly disappointing specimen under a microscope. "You," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "I don't know who you are, but I will find out. And I assure you, by the time the Board of Trustees at Johns Hopkins hears about how one of our brightest minds was treated, so will everyone else." She didn't wait for a response. She simply turned and led Imani out of the room, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Principal Thompson gave Karen one last look, a look that promised a meeting that would be anything but pleasant, and followed them out, closing the door behind him and leaving Karen alone with her students and the ruins of her career. The moment the door clicked shut, the dam of silence burst. The classroom erupted. "Oh my God, did you see her face? Johns Hopkins. Are you kidding me? Mrs. Albright is so fired. I can't believe she called the cops. That is messed up. I feel so bad for Imani. She's always so nice and quiet." Karen stood frozen in the middle of the room, the cacophony of her students' chatter washing over her. But she barely heard it. Her mind was a maelstrom of Dr. Thorne's chilling words. "I will find out. The Board of Trustees at Johns Hopkins. So will everyone else." This was no longer about a detention slip or a parent-teacher conference. This was about a prestigious, powerful institution. An institution with lawyers, with influence, with a national reputation to protect. She had not just provoked a principal. She had provoked a titan. A slow, creeping terror, far more real than the imagined threat of a sleeping teenager, began to take hold. She looked at the faces of her students. They were no longer just bored kids. They were witnesses. 32 witnesses to her prejudice, her arrogance, her catastrophic misjudgment. She saw the contempt in their eyes, the lack of any sympathy. She had lost them. In the space of 15 minutes, she had gone from being a respected, if feared, teacher to a pariah, a villain, a meme in the making. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a notification from a news app, then another, and another. Someone in the class, probably Kyle, with his ever-present phone, had already started broadcasting the story. A picture of Imani sleeping, followed by a picture of the police in the classroom. The caption was simple and devastating. "Teacher calls cops on black girl for napping in AP Physics. Turns out she's a genius from Johns Hopkins. Northwood nightmare racism in schools." The story was already out. The karma wasn't just coming for Karen Albright. It was already here, and it was moving at the speed of the internet. Her carefully controlled kingdom of room 314 had become a fishbowl, and the entire world was about to start tapping on the glass. The hum of the fluorescent lights now sounded like a death knell. The principal's office at Northwood High had always been a place of intimidation for students, but for Karen Albright, it now felt like the antechamber to her own execution. The plush guest chair was cold and unyielding, a stark contrast to the boiling shame and panic churning in her stomach. Across the vast mahogany desk, Principal Thompson sat with his head in his hands, not in a gesture of fatigue, but of profound, soul-deep disappointment. Dr. Aris Thorne paced before the large window, overlooking the school's manicured lawn, her movements sharp and predatory like a caged leopard. Imani was not present. Dr. Thorne had immediately sent her back to her host family's home in a chauffeured car from a service she had on speed dial. "I want to understand Karen. I really do." Mark Thompson began, finally looking up. His voice was devoid of its usual warmth. "Walk me through the thought process. Help me understand how you get from a student dozing off to calling 911. Karen swallowed hard, her mouth as dry as chalk dust. "Mark, why?" She was unresponsive. "I've been trained that if a student is unresponsive, we need to seek medical attention." I was concerned. The lie sounded flimsy, even to her own ears. Dr. Thorne stopped her pacing and whirled around, her eyes blazing with contempt. "Oh, save it. Please just save it. Don't insult our intelligence by pretending this was about concern. You didn't call the school nurse who is located 50 feet down the hall. You didn't call the school resource officer. You called 911 and reported a disruptive and unresponsive individual language specifically chosen to elicit a heightened police response. This wasn't about concern. This was about power. This was about prejudice." "That's not true," Karen protested, her voice rising with a desperate defensive pitch. "I'm not a racist. I have taught students of all backgrounds for 23 years. And how many of them have you had arrested for taking a nap?" Dr. Thorne shot back, her voice dangerously quiet. "Let me guess. 0. What was different about Imani, Mrs. Albright? Was it her distracting braids? Her worn backpack? Or was it simply the fact that she was a black face in your pristine, white-dominated advanced placement classroom, and you assumed she didn't belong?" Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking at the hidden truths Karen had spent a lifetime denying. She had seen Imani not as a student, but as an interloper. She had seen her exhaustion not as a sign of overwork, but of laziness. She had judged, condemned, and sentenced her based on a vile cocktail of stereotypes and personal insecurity. "Mark," Dr. Thorne continued, turning her attention back to the principal. "The damage control on this needs to be swift and decisive. Johns Hopkins sent Imani to your school in good faith, based on your sterling reputation. That reputation is currently being torched on social media as we speak. The hashtag #TeacherKaren is trending on Twitter. A student in that class, a Kyle, is live streaming his account of what happened, and it is vivid." Mark winced. He had already seen it. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Parents were calling. The superintendent was calling. A reporter from the local news channel was already parked at the school's entrance. The Johns Hopkins STEM Institute is funded by several major philanthropic organizations. Dr. Thorne stated, her tone now shifting from anger to the cold, hard calculus of consequences. The Beaumont Foundation is our primary benefactor. Their charter has a zero-tolerance clause for any partner institution involved in discriminatory practices. This incident, as it stands, is a flagrant violation. This puts our funding and your school's partnership with us in jeopardy. The Beaumont Foundation. The name sent a fresh wave of ice water through Mark Thompson's veins. They were a massive, nationally recognized organization. Their name attached to Northwood was a badge of honor, a mark of prestige that helped with everything from property values in the district to college admissions for their graduates. "What do you need, Aris?" Mark asked, his voice heavy with resignation. He knew this was no longer a negotiation. It was about managing the terms of surrender. First, Doctor, Thorne said, ticking points off on her fingers. A full public and unequivocal apology from the school district to Imani Washington and her family. Second, Imani will of course be withdrawn from this school immediately. She will continue her observational studies at Crestwood Academy across town, who I've already spoken with and are delighted and honored to have her. Third, I want a full investigation into Mrs. Albright's teaching history for patterns of discriminatory behavior. And fourth, she paused, her eyes locking onto Karen. I want her pulled. Not suspended, not reassigned, fired. Her presence in a classroom is a liability that neither of our institutions can afford. Karen gasped, a strangled, desperate sound. You can't do that. I have tenure. The union. Your union will drop you so fast your head will spin when they see the video and the potential lawsuit. Dr. Thorne cut her off mercilessly. A lawsuit, by the way, that Imani's parents are already discussing with their attorneys. They're both lawyers, you see. In fact, her father is a senior partner at one of the top civil rights law firms in the country. They are, shall we say, well equipped for this kind of fight. The final brick in Karen's wall of denial crumbled into dust. This wasn't just a quiet, unassuming girl from the South. She was the daughter of high-powered civil rights attorneys. The layers of Karen's catastrophic misjudgment were deeper and more devastating than she could have ever imagined. She hadn't just picked the wrong student to bully. She had picked a fight with a family that specialized in dismantling people like her. The door to the principal's office opened, and his secretary, a kind older woman named Mary, poked her head in. Her face was pale. Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the superintendent is on line 2. The president of the school board is on line 3, and a producer from Good Morning America is on line 4. The national media. It was happening. Mark Thompson looked at Karen, and for the first time she saw not anger, but a profound, weary sadness. Karen, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Go home. The district will be in touch regarding your employment status. You are on administrative leave, effective immediately. Do not, under any circumstances, attempt to contact any students or staff. It was over. Her 23-year career, her kingdom of room 314, her carefully constructed life, all of it had been immolated in a single, stupid, hateful act. She rose from the chair, her legs unsteady. As she walked towards the door, a ghost in her own life, she could hear Dr. Thorne's voice, already in damage control mode, speaking to the principal. Now about the public statement, Mark. The language needs to be precise. We need to frame this not just as an unfortunate incident, but as a teachable moment for the entire district. Karen didn't hear the rest. She stumbled out of the office and into the hallway. The bell rang, signaling the end of 4th period. The doors of the classrooms opened, and the hallway flooded with students. As they saw her, a wave of whispers and pointed fingers followed her down the hall. They held up their phones, not even trying to hide that they were recording her walk of shame. She didn't go home. She couldn't. Instead, she drove to the only place she could think of, a small, quiet park overlooking a lake. She sat on a cold metal bench, the world-class education she prided herself on, providing reduced to a trending topic of national outrage. Her phone buzzed again. It was a text from her husband. Turn on the news. What did you do? She looked at her reflection in the dark screen of her phone. She saw a tired, middle-aged woman with fear in her eyes. She had wanted to teach Imani a lesson, to put her in her place. But the universe had a funny, brutal way of delivering karma. The lesson had been for her, and it was a lesson in humility and consequence in the destructive power of a prejudice she had refused to see in herself. And it was a lesson she would be learning for the rest of her life in front of the entire world. The hard karma hadn't just hit back. It had shattered her existence into 1,000,000 irreparable pieces. The days that followed were a masterclass in swift, systematic dismantling. Karen Albright's life, once a neatly organized structure of routine and perceived authority, was being deconstructed brick by brick while the entire world watched. The park bench became her refuge, a place of grim anonymity as her face and name became infamous. The first blow was official. The promised email from the school district arrived less than 24 hours after the incident. It was cold, corporate, and final. Following an emergency session of the school board, a session Karen was not invited to, her contract was terminated, effective immediately. The union, as Dr. Thorne had predicted, had not just failed to support her. They had proactively released a statement condemning her actions and reaffirming their commitment to creating safe and inclusive learning environments for all students. They had seen the tidal wave of public opinion and had leaped into the nearest lifeboat, leaving Karen to drown. Tenure the shield she had believed to be impenetrable had been rendered meaningless in the face of such overwhelming and well-documented malfeasance. The second blow was legal. A sleek, cream-colored envelope delivered by a stoic courier who seemed to know he was delivering a verdict arrived at her front door. It contained a summons. Imani Washington's parents, true to Dr. Thorne's word, were suing. They were suing Karen Albright personally, the Northwood High School District, and the local police department. The lawsuit alleged racial discrimination, false imprisonment, defamation, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The damages they were seeking were astronomical, a figure clearly designed not just to compensate, but to punish and to serve as a national deterrent. The document listed the plaintiff's counsel, a renowned civil rights firm, whose victories were legendary. Karen was no longer just a fired teacher. She was the central defendant in a landmark legal case. But the most brutal and unrelenting assault was public. The story had gone from a viral hashtag to a full-blown media firestorm. Teacher Karen wasn't just a trend. It was a cultural shorthand for a specific brand of privileged racist arrogance. Her face, an unflattering screenshot from Kyle's live stream, was everywhere on cable news chyrons, on the front page of digital newspapers, and in endless savage memes. She was depicted as a villain from a Disney movie, as the final boss of all Karens. Her home address was leaked online. Cars would drive by slowly, the occupants shouting insults or simply laying on the horn. A local pizza place, in a grotesque publicity stunt, started offering a cancelled Karen special, a plain white pizza with nothing on it. Her husband, a mild-mannered accountant named Tom, was caught in the shrapnel. His firm, under pressure from clients and a barrage of negative online reviews, asked him to take an indefinite leave of absence. His face by association had become toxic. Their friends stopped calling. Invitations to neighborhood barbecues and book club meetings evaporated. They were social lepers, isolated in their once prestigious suburban home, which now felt like a prison. "How could you be so stupid, Karen?" Tom had yelled during one of their many circular, despairing arguments. "How could you not see what you were doing?" "I don't know." She would wail back the answer, both a lie and the truest thing she had ever said. She didn't know because she had never looked. She had never questioned the sour cocktail of resentment and fear that had been brewing inside her for years. She had called it standards. She had called it discipline. She had never called it by its real name, prejudice. One evening, driven by a masochistic impulse, she found herself watching an exclusive interview with Imani and her parents on a prime-time news program. Imani was poised, articulate, and heartbreakingly graceful. She spoke not with anger, but with a profound sadness. "The saddest part," Imani said, her large, intelligent eyes looking directly into the camera, "is that I was tired for a reason. Dr. Thorne and I had been up until 3 a.m. the night before at the university's observatory, calibrating the spectrograph on the main telescope for a project I'm working on, studying the atmospheric composition of exoplanets. I was tired because I was doing the exact thing Mrs. Albright claimed to value the pursuit of knowledge. She just couldn't see it. When she looked at me, she didn't see a scientist. She just saw a problem." The words struck Karen with the force of a physical blow. The exhaustion she had interpreted as the lethargy of a misspent youth on TikTok was in fact the noble fatigue of a young astronomer. The girl she had tried to have arrested was spending her nights gazing at the stars, while Karen had spent her days mired in the muck of her own ignorance. The interview ended with Imani's father, a distinguished man, with a calm but firm demeanor, speaking about the lawsuit. "This isn't just about our daughter," he said. "Imani is fortunate. She has resources. She has a support system. But what about the other Imanis? The black and brown children in classrooms across this country who don't have a Dr. Thorne to swoop in, who don't have parents who are lawyers. They are suspended, expelled, and funneled into the school-to-prison pipeline for minor infractions that their white classmates get a pass for. This lawsuit is for them. We are seeking to establish a precedent and to fund a new foundation dedicated to educational justice and combating racial bias in schools. We are going to turn Mrs. Albright's hateful act into a force for good." Karen turned off the television, the silence of the room roaring in her ears. They were going to use her name, her mistake, to build a legacy of justice. Her infamy was going to be the bedrock of a foundation. It was the ultimate crushing irony. The hard karma hadn't just taken her job and her reputation, it had taken her very identity and reforged it into a symbol of the very thing she swore she wasn't. It was a life sentence of a different kind, one with no possibility of parole. She was no longer Karen Albright, teacher. She was teacher Karen, the catalyst. And that was a lesson she would carry in shame and regret for the rest of her days. 6 weeks later, the world had spun on, as it always does. The initial media inferno surrounding teacher Karen had cooled to smoldering embers, kept alive only by the occasional cable news retrospective on viral moments of the year. For the world, it was old news. But for Karen Albright and Imani Washington, the consequences of that single catastrophic afternoon in room 314 had become the defining architecture of their new lives. Imani walked the halls of Crestwood Academy, her new school as a living myth. Crestwood was everything Northwood wasn't: progressive, diverse, and overtly welcoming. Teachers greeted her with warm, encouraging smiles. Students would either give her a wide, respectful berth, as if she were visiting royalty, or approach her with a breathless, fan-like reverence. They didn't see a classmate. They saw the girl from the news, the prodigy from Johns Hopkins, the quiet hero who had inadvertently sparked a national conversation. But the reverence was a cage of a different kind. In her new AP physics class, A subject she had once loved for its clean, predictable laws, she now felt a paralyzing self-consciousness. When the teacher asked a complex question about quantum mechanics, Imani knew the answer. The equations bloomed in her mind with perfect clarity. Yet she hesitated. She felt the weight of every eye in the room on her. If she answered, would it be seen as showing off? If she didn't, would they think she wasn't as smart as her reputation suggested? The simple joy of learning had been tainted by the burden of being a symbol. One afternoon, Dr. Thorne found her in the school's greenhouse, staring blankly at a collection of orchids. "You're 1,000,000 miles away," Aris said gently, standing beside her. "I was just thinking," Imani said, her voice quiet. "Everyone here is so nice. It feels like I should be happy. But I feel like I'm performing all the time. I'm Imani Washington. Not just Imani. What happened wasn't your fault, but the aftermath is your burden to carry." Dr. Thorne acknowledged her usual sharp demeanor, softened by empathy. "The world has turned you into a symbol, and symbols don't get to have bad days or be unsure of themselves. But you do. You've earned that right more than anyone. Your only job is to be the brilliant, curious, sometimes tired young woman you are. The world will just have to deal with it." Imani gave her a small, grateful smile. The cage was still there, but Dr. Thorne's words felt like she had been handed a key. For Karen Albright, there was no key. There were only more locks. Her attempts to secure legal representation had become a humiliating tour of every law office in a 50-mile radius. The reputable firms wouldn't even grant her a meeting. Their paralegals would deliver the rejection over the phone with a tone of rehearsed, icy politeness. Her case was radioactive, a guaranteed loser that would bring nothing but bad press. She finally found a lawyer named Sal Peterman, a man whose office was located in a strip mall above a bail bondsman and smelled faintly of stale cigars. Sal was a portly man with a rumpled suit and a face that seemed permanently weary of the world's poor choices. He leaned back in his creaking chair after hearing her version of the story, a version still peppered with self-serving justifications. He steepled his fingers and looked at her over the top of them. "Let me be blunt, Mrs. Albright," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "You're cooked. You're burnt toast. The evidence against you isn't just a smoking gun. It's a whole platoon of artillery firing at you from point-blank range. We're not aiming for an acquittal. We're not even aiming for a sympathetic jury. We are aiming for a settlement that doesn't require you to sell your internal organs on the black market." The brutal honesty was more jarring than any shouted insult. "So what do I do?" Karen asked, her voice a pathetic whisper. "You get humble," Sal said, leaning forward. "You disappear. You pray that the Washington family is more interested in making a point than in utterly destroying you. And you start figuring out how to live a life where your name is synonymous with bigotry. Because that's your new reality." The new reality made even the simplest tasks feel like a walk through a minefield. One Tuesday, driven by the need for milk and the dwindling contents of their pantry, Karen drove to a grocery store 2 towns over, wearing a baseball cap and large sunglasses, a pathetic disguise. As she stood in the checkout line, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned, her heart seizing with panic, to see a young woman, probably in her early 20s. "Mrs. Albright," the woman asked, her expression not one of anger, but of a kind of sad recognition. "I was in your general science class maybe 6 years ago. You probably don't remember me. I'm Amy." Karen didn't remember her. Amy had been one of the countless forgettable faces that had passed through her classroom. "I just wanted to say," Amy continued, her voice soft, "I was never very good at science. You once told me I shouldn't even bother applying to a 4-year college because I clearly didn't have the aptitude. You said it in front of the whole class." She gave a small, humorless smile. "Anyway, I just graduated from the State University's nursing program. With honors. I just thought you should know." Amy then turned, paid for her groceries, and walked away, leaving Karen standing by the conveyor belt, her carton of milk seeming to weigh 1,000 pounds. The casual cruelty of a forgotten remark delivered years ago, and meaningless to her, had been a defining, motivating wound for this young woman. How many other Amys were there? How many other small, thoughtless cuts had she inflicted over her 23 years, all stemming from the same ugly place of judgment and arrogance? That night, the local news ran a story that marked the final perfect nail in the coffin of her former life. It was a celebratory piece about the official launch of the Imani Washington Educational Justice Foundation, funded by a massive initial settlement from the Northwood School District. Its first major grant was announced a statewide program to implement and fund independent third-party racial bias reporting systems in every public high school. The news anchor smiled brightly. The foundation, created in the wake of the infamous Teacher Karen incident, aims to ensure that what happened to Imani Washington never happens to another student in this state again. Karen stared at the screen, numb. It was complete. Her name, the one she shared with her husband and had passed down to her children, was now and forever would be a brand for intolerance, a catalyst for the very justice that was created to oppose everything she had done. She hadn't just been fired. She hadn't just been sued. She had been rendered into a lesson, and the school of public opinion was a harsh, unforgiving teacher. The story of Imani Washington and Karen Albright isn't just about one teacher and one student. It's a powerful, gut-wrenching reminder that prejudice often hides behind a badge of authority, and that our assumptions can have devastating, life-altering consequences. Imani's brilliance was her shield, but it shouldn't have been necessary. Her exhaustion was a sign of her incredible dedication, a fact that was twisted into an excuse for persecution. This story is a call to look deeper, to challenge our own biases, and to demand accountability. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it reach more people. Share it with your friends and family to spark a conversation. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the stories that matter. Thank you for watching.